Consent decrees in question, what a new Department of Justice could mean for the city of Minneapolis and its police department, and why the city is fighting so hard for it to happen. Minneapolis Police Federation attorney Jim Michels joins me. Jim, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Liz. Always good to see you, too.
You represent the rank-and-file police officers of the Minneapolis Police Department, the Police Federation, in this consent decree, which is a legally binding court-enforced agreement between the Department of Justice and a police department designed to, quote, reform unlawful or unconstitutional policing practices. Not exactly the story, as we've learned over the years here, but Jim, this federal consent decree is currently on hold. In Minnesota's largest city, where do things stand at the moment?
You know, I'm assuming that most of your viewers are probably not experts on this stuff because I'd probably worry about them if they were. So let's just back up just a slight bit. What happens before a consent decree is created is that the Department of Justice will conduct an investigation of a police department. And usually they're called in because somebody notifies them and makes an allegation that the department and its officers have engaged in either unconstitutional or otherwise unlawful policing. And so that's what happened in Minneapolis in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. And the Justice Department took roughly 2 years to come up with its investigation, and then issued what it calls essentially a charge or a finding. And it found that based on its investigation that the Minneapolis Police Department does engage in a pattern and practice of unconstitutional and unlawful policing. That then triggered the process for the Department of Justice attorneys to sit down with representatives from the city of Minneapolis to negotiate the consent decree, which is just really kind of a fancy word for settlement agreement. And the settlement agreement, in order for it to have effect, it has to be approved by the court. And courts don't just take settlement agreements, they have to have a lawsuit or some sort of legal action in order to do that. So the first step of creating the legal action is the Department of Justice files a complaint, just like any other lawsuit, starts with a complaint alleging the misconduct by MPD. What happened in this case, which is kind of common with consent decrees, on the very same day that they filed the complaint, they filed the consent decree. In other words, filed the settlement agreement. So unlike most litigation where a complaint gets filed, the other party submits an answer, usually denying the allegations, then you go into years of discovery and then maybe come up with a settlement agreement. This is a canned deal right from the get-go when you file the settlement agreement on the same day and usually within minutes of filing the complaint in the action. So that's kind of where we stand right now. That happened back in January. It was actually 2 weeks to the day before the inauguration of the Trump administration. And that was clearly not an accident. The thought process, and it's been publicly stated by a number of the Minneapolis elected officials, that they thought that if they could somehow get the consent decree into court before Trump took office, that would give some leg up to try and get the court to approve it. The case was assigned to Judge Magnuson, a very senior member of the Minnesota District Court, and Judge Magnuson took the case under advisement and essentially said that he was not going to make any ruling on the consent decree for a period of 60 days. Shortly after the consent decree was filed, within a week, that on behalf of the Police Federation, I filed a motion to intervene, which all that is asking the court to allow the Police Federation to be heard because the settlement agreement, the only parties to that were the Federal Department of Justice and the City of Minneapolis. So the Federation was not invited to the table in those conversations. And of course, our interests are to make sure that there's nothing in the consent decree that violates our statutory rights under PELRA or our labor rights under our collective bargaining agreement. So Judge Magnuson also took the Federation's motion to intervene under advisement and is basically waiting to decide how to proceed in the case. In the meantime, obviously, we had a change of administration. The Trump administration has made it clear they don't think too highly of this consent decree process, and so the Department of Justice made an initial motion to Judge Magnuson to stay, basically asking the court to continue to hold on to the case to see how the Justice Department wanted to proceed. They didn't make any commitments whether they were going to pursue the case or dismiss it, but outside the formal pleadings in court, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of it actually by members of the Trump administration that seem to indicate that they do not plan to move forward with the consent decree in Minneapolis or in many other jurisdictions around the country.
But just to go back to that, Jim, so the city objected to the stay. The city, the defendant in this lawsuit, as you've pointed out, seems pretty eager to go forward with this, despite everything we know. Court filings say the city says there is no legitimate need for the pause. They're not going forward with this. Not going forward with this would harm the city, according to what they filed. Just from a legal standpoint, though, have you ever seen anything quite like this before from a defendant, just so eager for this to happen, to go through?
No, it's really unusual. So yeah, you're right. So what happened is that when the DOJ asked the court for the stay, initially for the first 30 days, the city did not object. That stay was set to expire last week. The DOJ made another motion to extend it for another 30 days, and that's when Minneapolis formally objected to the motion and essentially is asking the court, no, we want this consent decree to move forward. The only time that I can even think of why a defendant would want a case to move forward is if they thought that the court was going to dismiss the case outright. In other words, say, defendant, you didn't do anything wrong, case is done, let's all go home. But that's clearly not what the city of Minneapolis is intending to do here. In fact, in council meetings and in many other forums, they've made it clear that they intend to use the consent decree to reform the police department. So this is an unusual case where the defendant in litigation wants to be sued, apparently.
You know, there were nearly 900 Minneapolis police officers at the beginning of May of 2020. Don't need to talk to you too much about this. You know this all well. How many are there now? And do the officers you represent feel like they've had a voice in any of this, Jim?
Well, there's two questions there. So the first one is the easy and sad answer is that right now the department is hovering, give or take, about 500 officers. So they're down to roughly 60% of their authorized strength. And just so the public is clear on that, that includes, the investigators, so sergeants that are assigned to investigations, and administrative, the chief's office, everything else. So the actual number of police officers available on the street to answer calls on a daily basis, a little bit under 400. It's as low as it's ever been in any time that I can think, and I've been representing the Police Federation for 35 years. In fact, Minneapolis got sued by a group of citizens a few years ago challenging the failure of the department to maintain the staffing level at the amount that's required under the city charter. That charter requirement is over 700 officers. So they are substantially below even what the city charter requires. So the other question was, how do officers feel about it? I will give the Department of Justice credit in that during their investigation part of this procedure, they were good about reaching out to officers and taking their input. And in fact, there were many things in the consent decree that the officers and the Federation could support, such as more training for officers, more mental health resources available for the officers, It actually called into question the department's staffing model to try and get more staff. So I do think that in the investigative process, a lot of officers believe that they were heard and had an opportunity to talk freely and openly. It's in the settlement conversation and about what this so-called reform will look like, where officers feel that they have not been heard or have not, even had the opportunity to be heard. In great part, that's why the Federation moved to intervene in the legal action.
Last summer, we featured a police training expert. He spent years studying these consent decrees across the country, Dr. Travis Yates. But he points out that of the 20 most violent cities in America, over half are ran currently by the Department of Justice. He says they cause destruction and damage when it comes to these consent decrees. As you've pointed out, President Trump has long been opposed, it seems, to consent decrees, sounding like his DOJ could do away with this altogether. But even just, that language about MPD did engage in discriminatory policing without even being able to counter that, just these narratives and how damaging they have been for the city of Minneapolis.
That is a huge part of the problem, is that, if this litigation initiated on the premise that the Minneapolis Police Department, and as you've said, other police departments around the country have truly engaged in a pattern of discriminatory and unconstitutional policing. Normally in a court case, the party making those allegations has the burden of proof to go into court, to produce evidence, to have a jury determine, yes, that's happened, or no, you failed to prove that that's happened. To my knowledge, there's only been one case in the history of consent decrees brought by the U.S. Department of Justice that's ever been litigated. And in that case, the Department of Justice lost. Cities are too quick to roll over, to just accept the premise that this is happening. And it's incredibly damaging not only to the officers, but it's also damaging to the police department itself, because how do you recover from the public's perception when the elected officials that are in charge of overseeing and running the police department are basically saying, yeah, they're bad, they're discriminatory, they violate the Constitution? What needs to happen to try to change the public's perception? It befuddles me. And it's unfair to the men and women that put on the blue shirt and the badge every day and risk their lives to try to keep us safe. If you read, actually, even the state Human Rights Department, when it put its 72-page investigative report out there, I did a word search. The words union, federation, labor contract don't even appear in that report. It's 72 pages about the fact that the reason that the MPD is what it is by the failure of management to address problems when they become aware of them. And that's not the obligation of other officers or the union. In fact, many instances, officers have reported fellow officers who have acted outside the boundaries of what, is acceptable police behavior, and the department took no action. So, to the extent there are issues there, accountability starts at the top of an organization, not at the bottom. But at least in Minneapolis, they don't seem to understand that simple concept.
Well said. When do you expect to know more? Can you predict what will end up happening here, Jim?
That's a great question. If I could predict stuff, I'd have won the Powerball a long time ago, and we wouldn't even be talking, maybe from my island someplace. But here's the next step. So the stay that Judge Magnuson has issued would take us somewhere into mid to late April. At some point, I expect the DOJ to give some indication to the court whether it plans to dismiss the case and to essentially, back out of the consent decree. In other words, saying, court, we don't need you to approve this settlement agreement because we're no longer pursuing this action against the city of Minneapolis. If that were to happen, while I'm prognosticating here, I would fully expect the city of Minneapolis to object to that, to say, no, we want the consent decree. Again, because they've made it clear that they intend to use that to try to weaponize it, either against the Federation or against officers or in the court of public opinion. Lord only knows what. But, this really gets to a bigger issue that I've been preaching about for a long time, and you know that. You and I have had these conversations. But we're at a point now, because of the staffing crisis that you raised earlier, where literally, and I am not in any way suggesting that MPD or any police organization couldn't do a better job, be more efficient, deal better and quicker with officers who cross the line and who have committed misconduct. So I'm not dismissing that outright. But what I am suggesting is, when you take on these wholesale, quote unquote, reforms of a department, you should start with the premise as to whether what you're trying to do is going to help public safety or hurt public safety. And in my mind, the biggest public safety crisis we have right now is there are too few men and women that want to be or stay police officers. We need more cops. And so anything that we do, we should put through the lens of, will this help us attract good people to this noble profession, or will this continue to drive people away? And if for anybody who wants to read this consent decree, it's on the City of Minneapolis website. Go find it, take a look at it, and ask that question for yourself. Would you want to live or have your son or daughter go to work every day with that kind of microscope on everything that they do? And if the answer to that is no, then I think that's the bigger public policy conversation that we need to have.
You're so right. The evidence is there. It seems even year after year that this is not helping. Absolutely. But again, Attorney Jim Michels, thank you so much for being here. This has been a real eye-opener. And the thing is, it affects all of us. We all need to care. And I think for far too long, people have ignored it, thinking that it, perhaps doesn't have to do with me. But this has spread like a plague throughout the state and the country, to be quite honest.
It really does, because when we undermine even one law enforcement department, especially a large, department like the Minneapolis PD, which at least used to be, it's no longer the case, but used to be the largest police department in the state. That undermines the public's trust in all police and all law enforcement officers everywhere. And that does not make us safer. It makes us less safe.
Jim, thank you for speaking out.
Thanks, Liz, for having me.
That will do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We will see you next time.